good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you join us from around the world, and thank you very much for doing so. As you can see, the title of today's session is in front of you, essentially listening to marginalised voices and how doing so can provide benefits. And I'll get into it, but we have two absolutely fantastic speakers with us today. And we're very, very pleased and honoured to have them with us. I'm sure they will be able to provide some absolutely fantastic insights. And of course, everybody here will get the opportunity to give them some great questions, to share their own insights and experiences as well. So I always start or seem to think about this at the moment of saying, well, I think we all start from a similar position at the moment of saying, well, we know we need to do more. We know we need to create more positive impacts. There's lots of evidence out there at the moment that is, you only have to look at any app and it's pretty much doom and gloom at the moment. But the phrase I'm using at the moment, and this is something I keep saying to myself, it's the sort of, the morning challenge in the mirror, if not now, when? How are we going to create the world we want, the society we want, the impacts that we want? How do we move from rhetoric to reality? How do we make good intentions a reality? There's lots of good intentions out there. If not now, when? And this series of webinars brought to you by Social Value International and the Efrico Academy really are trying to help us think these challenges through. As we have today, some absolute thought leaders with us, and we're going to share global best practice from around the world. Today, in particular, I want us to start thinking about this idea that the stakeholder model is accepted. I'm sure many of us, if not all, would say, oh, last year the US roundtable said that the stakeholder model is now king. Well, it's really important. We know that it's crucial for the sustainability of organizations, for the sustainability of ourselves, and of course, the planet. But I think we can too easily listen to our echo chamber perhaps sometimes. And I think we need to ask if it really is accepted. Because there's a lot of rhetoric that the stakeholder model is important, but actually we need to ask ourselves a really important fundamental question that says, well, are those stakeholders, and by stakeholders, let's talk about people, particularly those people who are affected by decisions, are they able to influence those decisions? And particularly those people affected by decisions who are more marginalized, are without power in the decision-making process. So I think we need to challenge some of the almost taken for granted ideas that surround us at the moment. And I'm not going to do that today. It's going to be our two fantastic speakers. My job is really easy. I ask some questions, I open the floor to everybody else, and that's pretty much it. But for those of you that don't know me, and it's great to see some friends on this call as well, I haven't seen for a while. I'm Adam from Social Value International. And we're an organization, we are a network of networks that have the mission to change the way society accounts for value, because we believe by doing so, we change that rhetoric into a reality. And it's a reality where we can improve people's well-being, we can increase equality, and we can reduce environmental harm through the decisions that we take as individuals and as organizations. I would encourage you to have a look at our professional practitioner pathway, the 3 Ps that I've got in my head, and how Social Value International, by setting global standards on what all of this means, alongside many of our partners, we can help you on that journey to improving your own practice. And alongside one of our fantastic partners, the Efiko Academy, the idea is that we can support you to become those impact professionals, those social impact leaders. And I think it's always important to just pause for a moment and say, well, what does Efiko mean? I think it's really crucial. We have the founders of Efiko with us today, and there's a real genuineness that impact is a language and a practice that is for everybody. So Efiko is Esperanto for impact, a universal language trying to convey the ideas that impact is for all. And Efiko work with a range of standard setters and have some fantastic, a growing range of online training programs. that really do, as the key points say there, put ideas into practice. It's not just myself as lead trainer talking and delivering. I'm sure, as you can tell now, I quite like the sound of my own voice, but it's about putting these ideas into practice. But it's also about hearing other voices as well. There's a real genuineness, a real diversity of voices. You will hear from practitioners and global experts from all parts of the world, from all sectors, from a range of different backgrounds. And it is a very interactive approach. There is no one size fits all. And with Efiko, you can learn in a cohort. You can learn as a social learner, digesting the material at any time that suits you, but also being part of a very active and vibrant community. And I can guarantee that, because I've been working with a cohort just today, and it was a really genuinely effective learning experience for everybody involved, and one that personally I thoroughly enjoyed as well, and I know the learners did. So please do check out the Efrico Academy. We'll talk about the nature of the training at the very end of this. But I think we should now get into speaking about this series of webinars. So this is number 2. I'm sure many of you saw the first webinar we had, very successful event with Jeremy and Amanda, where again that idea of taking rhetoric and putting it into reality was there, really talking about global standards and developments around consensus. But today, without further ado, let's talk about our fantastic speakers that we have. And one of our speakers, Bonnie Chu, is Managing Director of the Social Investment Consultancy Organization. And this is a global network of consultants who specialize in impact measurement and social investment strategies. Bonnie, I know this personally, Bonnie is an avid advocate, put my teeth in, an avid advocate of participatory research, listening to the voices that matter, thinking about how that applies in terms of downward accountability and ensuring that people's voices are heard and respected. Bonnie is also the founder of an award-winning social enterprise and, amongst many other things, also works as a senior contributor for Forbes magazine, writing around gender and inclusivity. So Bonnie, thank you ever so much for joining us. It's an absolute privilege. And we also have Joanne Anderson with us. Now, Joanne is the founder and managing director of a consultancy that provides support to public, private, and third sector organizations in the United Kingdom. And I'm sure Joanne won't mind me saying you have over 30 years experience as an equality, diversity, and social inclusion practitioner and coach. Another absolute passionate advocate of listening to people, of respecting people, and helping organizations understand that inequality has to be taken seriously, and that can help their performance. And another thing that Joanne is doing at the moment is Joanne is one of the mayoral candidates, I hope to say very soon, one of the Labour candidates for the city of Liverpool in the UK. So you know this, Jo. I wish you all of the best in that. So that's it from me. We are incredibly fortunate to have these people with us. So I think what we should do is start to ask some questions. The format we will take is pretty standard. I'll ask a range of questions. Joanne and Bonnie will respond. If anybody has questions as we go, please do use the chat facility. My colleagues will manage that, will filter questions through. But if there is a real burning question, I don't think Joanne and Bonnie would mind if somebody was to raise their hand, and we'll give you the floor. But we will have an open Q&A for 15 minutes at the very end. So that's enough from me. Joanne, I'd like to go to you first, if that's okay. And it's a bit of an open question to you, but what are your experiences of what I would say actively listening to people? And why does it matter? How has it helped? Over to you, Joanne.
Thank you, Adam. I thought I was being shouted at then when you said, Joanne. I was like, oh, stand to attention. Hi, everyone. I've been working around a number of agendas for quite a long time, 3 decades now. So early jobs I've had have been policy development officers. I was community engagement lead in the Crown Prosecution Service for a while. I've always worked in social enterprises. I've always been a trainer and facilitator. And I was always quite confused by anyone designing a policy or a product or service without talking to the people that are affected. And I find, particularly in the civil service, still quite what's it called, ivory tower policy making, still quite common for a lot of people to sit in a room and design a policy that affects lots of people without having any clue how those people would react to that policy. So it never made much sense to me. And I set up a Black social enterprise in Liverpool about 20 years ago, which was an equality and diversity consultancy. And what I found, a large proportion of my work was about listening and engaging stakeholders on an agenda that policymakers needed to get feedback on, and translating what those needs and wants were. And so what I found is that policy or services from as a result of listening were designed in a way that addressed people's wants and needs. And now some organisations are not in a position to engage directly, and that's where an organisation like mine would come in, because I have a relationship of trust being of those groups I was normally engaging. So if people wanted to do research with Black organisations, as say, for example, or Black people around quality of life, then as a Black person, I would engage with those people and be able to translate what those wants and needs were. Sometimes taking on board expectations and addressing them as part of the process. So I think from listening, what you get is you get better products and services, you're more successful as an organisation, you meet people's wants and needs. And yeah, so the success of the work you do, I think, is based on listening to the people who it affects.
Thank you, Joanne. Great starts. Bonnie, I'm going to ask the same question, if that's okay. So what are your experiences, again, of actively listening to people, and what are the benefits of doing so?
Thank you, Adam. I think active listening is a concept that we probably quite take for granted, and a lot of people, do listen to their beneficiaries, their stakeholders, but actually I think true listening is only one where you listen and you then take actions on the feedback that you get. And I stress that importantly, because listening often is just used as a word like hearing someone, and you just get some feedback, but actually you don't really listen and you don't change as a result. I think, Adam, you really framed it very powerfully in the beginning. Those most affected by the decisions, how can they influence decision making? And I think listening, active listening to their voices is so important. So my experiences in this, I would say, come in a few things. So the first thing I would mention, my social enterprise that I started, which is about training marginalized women and girls all across the world, photography and storytelling. We use photography to start with because we realize that a lot of people actually cannot read and write. Illiteracy is a huge barrier for them to have their voices heard and to have their stories told across the world. And that actually stemmed from my grandmother, who is illiterate, but she loves photography and she uses her camera to capture the memory. So that really inspired me to start the idea Lensational. And from that experience, having trained women and girls across 23 countries, I can say really the benefits are, there's so many benefits. I mean, but the first thing I would say is you really realize what the real issues are that they are facing. So when it comes to a social enterprise or an organization, you have in your mind an intervention that you would like to offer to a group in need. But actually, we have our own assumptions on how things happen. And unless you really see the world from their perspective and listen, actively listening to what they want, your interventions could only go so far. So one example I can say is once we start training, we originally thought a lot of the issues that these women would face are issues relating to gender inequality or children's education. But actually from their photographs, we started seeing how important climate change is as an issue, because we started seeing a lot of pictures taken by those women and girls of their children fetching water, or how the climate has impacted their lives. And so we then, as an organization, really took this theme seriously. And then we started doing more around gender and climate. So this is just an example. If you actively listen, you become more relevant to the people you serve. And I think second experience I'll just mention very quickly is my role as an impact evaluator. So I support organizations. Sometimes I use the SROI approach that SVI has created. And in impact evaluation, when I support clients, whether that's a foundation or a social enterprise or a charity, to understand the impact of their work, I always try to make sure that in the very beginning that we have users, the beneficiaries, included in the whole process, that we are not just approaching them at the research stage and asking them, oh, can you give me some feedback? Let's really start from the beginning, ask them what kind of questions they really want answer from this research, what matters to them, and start really from the very beginning and back to the idea around power. Because how this would help is that you're doing research and evaluation, not just to tick the box and to show what you're doing, but actually the whole process is a process of empowerment and of changing power dynamics that currently exist within community. So the research and evaluation activity itself actually could have so much positive social impact. And so I'll just share 2 experiences to kick off the discussion.
Thank you both. I've heard power there a lot. And I wonder whether I could ask a bit further about that, Joanne, because you say it's important, and I like what you said, that people are you're simply confused as to why people wouldn't do this. So are you finding people are willing to listen to people's voices, and has that changed? I'm not suggesting, over a period of time.
So it's an interesting point, isn't it, around power? I still feel a lot in the sector, something that we suffer with, is it's something we do to people rather than with people. And so I feel the power dynamic in those conversations is really important. And I feel we need to do things with people rather than for them. So sometimes it feels, this is research that will benefit you, and we will make this program better to you. But building on Bonnie's point, what do you want out? That's much more of a co-design thing, isn't it? About, what do you want from this research? How does it help you start from the beginning? So yeah, I think power is really important, and representation in that is really important. So in my experiences, people don't open up quite so well when they're not represented across the power dynamic. And I think ensuring that you have representation of the groups that you're talking with, and the beneficiaries can see themselves in those people who are making the decisions, I think that's when you have better outcomes, because the power dynamic is a little bit more equal.
Thank you, Joanne. And Bonnie, same question really. Are people willing to listen? So you're getting powerful information. I love that phrase, true listening. It's about taking actions on feedback. So are decision makers, are they taking decisions based on feedback? Is that changing for a positive or not so?
I would say it's still a mixed picture. I would say organizations that have a reflective attitude of their own power and privilege tend to then value more the opinions that come from the field. But it does take a lot of humility. It does take us actually understanding that we are only facilitators, like we are not experts, and the experts are people we serve. It's a very different mindset, because probably most of us, I'm talking about the field of research and evaluation, most of us would have done lots of degrees or did a master's degree in order to get to a point where we can do research and evaluation. And we have been socialized to think learned experience is very important, and the methodologies are very important, rather than thinking about lived experience and valuing lived experience. I have, however, seen stakeholders take actions based on feedback, but I would say they often happen in more kind of local circumstances, or whereby the stakeholders already have built in the feedback loops. So for example, I've been involved in projects where you have a kind of citizens assembly or some kind of mechanisms where villagers come together and then they discuss different issues. And then if you layer research and evaluation on top of that, then you can make sure you share back the findings and then people can adapt accordingly. But when it comes to an international context, I have found it very difficult, especially if some of those feedback actually challenges what people assumed to be good. I don't know how we might change that. And I think part of it is about us, those who have power. And I, as a researcher and evaluator, constantly reflect on my own power. I think we have to commit to giving up that power or sharing that power. And really commit to doing that every day. I will just end it by saying that the idea of ethics in research, when I learned that in university, actually, I never got told that power is part of ethics. Like when you're designing a research, you have to tick all those boxes. Have you got consent? Have you got whatnot, so that you are ethical in your research? But actually, I think being part of being ethical is also the researchers realizing our own power and how we can actively shift those power, and to finally also make sure that the research findings get acted upon, because otherwise, really, what's the point? And we're just wasting people's time and perpetuating an unequal system.
Amazing, guys. Thank you. I mean, we're coming back to that, the challenges. I really like that phrase. Power is part of research ethics. And when you say it, it's like, well, yeah, of course it is. But I'm not sure I've ever heard anybody say it out loud. I think back to my own university days and research ethics. Yeah, do no harm, informed consent. Power, where is it? It's missing. So my next question then, building on that bit, is, and again, thinking about that need, you've both spoken about the need to be responsive and take action, do something with the results. Joanne, to what extent, how can we build in this thinking into practical impact management skills? And, taking a bit of a step back and a look upwards, I guess, is to say, well, how can those skills affect businesses? We've spoken about that. You both said it can improve performance and so on. But can it also help to create the more equitable society that we all want? Joanne, over to you. Big question, this one.
Question. I'm not sure where to start. I think my answer is yes, but let me break that down. So in terms of listening to people, making sure the voice is heard, making sure they can contribute, does that lead to equity? Yeah, I think it does. But I think, not to miss out on the other factors that are at play in those situations and those conversations. So my experience is very much based in the UK. I have worked across Europe on the issue of equality, diversity and inclusion, and we are at different stages in different countries about what we would say is acceptable practice around the power dynamic in terms of engaging with people. So, for example, and not to name any countries, but somebody was complaining about foreign students talking their own language at school. For example, in Britain, we would take that as perfectly acceptable. Of course, people might want to talk their own language in the tea break in the school scenario, whereas another country found that was unacceptable, or certainly the partners who we were working with. So I take on the point that what works in one society doesn't perhaps work in another. But I think what is imperative, and also there's some cultural differences around contributing and speaking up and having your voice heard, that you must do everything you can in your power to make sure that people are comfortable with that. So if I'm in certain parts of Europe, people will look to each other first before they speak. there's not so much of an acceptability that if I speak out about this, there's no detrimental consequences to what I say. Again, in England, we tend to be quite mouthy and say what we want and say what we feel and quite opinionated. That's not always, commonplace in certain cultures, particularly if you put that at an organisational level. For some organisations, it's acceptable to speak out, and for some organisations, it isn't. So I think there's work that organisations need to do to create a culture and environment that makes it acceptable to speak out, to allow people to have their voices to be heard, whether they like what is said or not, that there's no detrimental consequences to people being able to speak out. That makes all the difference in what you're going to get for your research. I'm not sure I did answer the question, Adam. I forgot the question now.
Yeah, it's because I gave you about 4 questions in one, Joanne. No, absolutely. I'll come back to you, I'm sure, on some of those points, because I think obviously what you're saying is absolutely perfect. I'm going to turn to Bonnie and ask about that impact management skill question, because you've spoken about listening to people and taking action. Now, to me, they are almost like, if you had to sum impact management up in 2 statements, that's what it would be. But I mean, do you think then that if people have those practical skills for measuring and managing impact, there is that genuine opportunity to make a meaningful difference?
I think if you're talking about the practitioners, so the ones who are going out and doing the research and compiling the reports and compiling the recommendations, then I think, yes, active listening, empathy as part of active listening, and taking actions, and being really mindful of power and commitment to sharing power. So those would be what I think are practical impact management skills, of course, beyond your grasp of the technical methods. But I think one barrier is, what's the motivation of the organization commissioning the research and evaluation in the first place? Most of them, in my experience, are actually under pressure to just prove impact rather than learning from impact. So that then means you can have the best researcher in the world who takes all those skills and who truly represents the people you're wanting to hear from, whatever that might be. You have your gold star evaluator and researcher, but then that person presents the findings to the organization that ultimately has the power to make a change. When, let's say, they can change the program and how it's delivered, but maybe they don't want to change. So I think sometimes now I've learned my lesson that when I do take on a piece of work, I do ask my clients whether what's their appetite for change? Are they truly committed to doing something about the feedback? Because if not, perhaps we shouldn't ask those questions and do the research in the first place. So I think practical impact management skills, definitely very important, but the understanding the motivation of the organization commissioning. And I think there's also more education that needs to be had around organizations commissioning research and evaluation. What do you look for from researcher and evaluator? And should you actively look for people who represent equity and inclusion in their ethos, or who want to challenge you, rather than just someone who give you what you want? Until we have that, I think it will be very hard to actually make impact management contribute to a more equitable society.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm trying to keep up with the chat questions that are coming in as well, which is really great. So please do, everyone, keep them coming. As I scroll up to the ones I was just looking at the moment, they're coming in thick and fast, which is a really good sign. I suppose, that there is a risk. There's always a risk with everything we're talking about, that it can sound overwhelming, daunting, challenging, and you've both said these things. It's not just the challenge of doing. There's the challenge of convincing others. And one of the contributors, Tom outlines that, as well as needing social value activists, you need social value activists who can communicate results. There's also a different question, or a question that came in, which was from Samantha. So I'll read that out. But Samantha, if you want to extend that question, please do after the contributions. Samantha asks, first to Bonnie, what are you doing specifically to ensure that your research activities, your impact measurement activities, are beneficial to the communities in themselves? And I like the word optimize. How do you optimize the impact of those interactions as well? Thank you, Samantha. So to you, Bonnie.
Great. Well, I will comment, and Samantha, please do jump in. I think practically in an ideal scenario, I would make sure that in the inception phase, when we design our impact management framework and research questions, that we actually involve the communities or the people most affected in designing those things. So I think here is also important that Joanne used the word before, co-design. So there are different levels of involvement, and I've learned there's a really great graphic actually of the co-production ladder. So there are different ways of involvement, meaning you can just ask someone, but that your relationship with them is still you know everything, you have all the power, and then they just say what they can. All the way to true co-production is that you have a recognition of the power that different people have, and you try to reconfigure the power so that everyone can truly speak their mind and that everyone's opinions are valued equally. So I've tried to do co-production in the creation of an impact management framework. The context of that was in East Africa, a fund that focuses on people with disabilities, and we involved disabled people together with the local partners and the UK partners in designing those metrics. But what that meant was I had to unlearn a lot of my own jargon in how I describe outcomes, indicators, and we had to come up with many different ways, including asking people to take photographs on how they feel, or using different keywords, just a lot of different creative methods in order to get there. But of course, we ended up having, I think, thousands of post-its that we actually needed to analyze, that we needed to make sense of, because the ultimate question we were asking was, for everyone, what's the change that you want to seek from this project? And actually, everyone's coming to this very differently, and it really challenged the funders' own assumption originally on what they think would help the disabled people. But that practically meant we did need to invest a lot of resources. And I, as the lead on this project, I was also very aware of my own power dynamics. And we had disabled people's organizations on the ground who in Uganda and Tanzania who did not do anything before on impact management, but I had to coach them so that they feel confident in really taking the lead. But most of the time, we don't have the time to actually do this basic step. Funders don't put enough resources to it. So the very small thing that I can do is at least think about my research incentives. If I don't have money to pay back the people giving their time, what are the non-monetary incentives I can give? Recognition, dignity, small things, and really ask them very upfront that we know your time is precious, and we are really sorry that we have very little budget for compensating for your time, but what can we do for you? And I think asking that, at least acknowledging their dignity, is the very little thing that we can do to optimize on the impact of those interactions.
Thank you very much. I think just, such powerful words, and showing people the respect and dignity, giving them the recognition that they deserve. Again, you would hope that they are such taken for, but they probably are taken for granted and not necessarily enacted as much as they should be. Joanne, practical suggestions as well. What would you provide, for people wanting to improve their own practice? And there are some questions coming in, so in a couple of moments we'll turn to the floor, and if people are willing to raise their hand, that would be great, rather than me read them out. But Joanne, practical suggestions for people wanting to improve their own practice.
So Bonnie has mentioned earlier about reflecting on your own privilege. You know, I could write a story of me being, you know, disadvantaged. I was brought up in a single parent family. You know, I pressed all the indicators, left school with no qualifications. I could write a real boohoo story of how I'm disadvantaged. Actually, I've got 17 aunties and uncles and 50 cousins. I've got great privilege and was spoilt rotten. So I think in terms of recognising your privilege, you're someone who's sort of black, working class, from a single parent family, brought up on a sink estate, can go, I have got lots of privilege. I think we all need to recognise where we have privilege. So I think that's absolutely important and vital as a practitioner, that you keep your own privilege in check. Giving up control, I find it really difficult. You know, to just hand over to something I've contributed to. It's my baby. I love it. I don't want to hand it over to somebody else. I also, on an ego level, want to get the credit for my input. You know, how dare somebody else? We hand this over to somebody else for them to enjoy all the credit and the benefit. But that's what that co-design is absolutely about: giving up control, letting people do what they feel fit and best. And so, giving up control is another important factor. I think some other issues that come into play around, sorry, I've lost the question, Adam. What was the question again?
Practical suggestions for people to improve their own practice.
So I think what I've learned from practice around equality and diversity and inclusion, I really did want to make this point. That's why it was important for me to remember. Often as a consultant, I would get a brief that is you know, is plain to see that there's no level of competency or understanding around equality and diversity and inclusion. And I remember working with a consultancy that worked with disabled people that wanted to correct the brief, and I was like, no, you get the work and then you correct the brief, but you educating all stakeholders as part of that journey. And so sometimes it is about, you know, the leadership or the commissioner to be educated as well as part of that journey. I would absolutely see that my role in this scenario is to, you know, pin them down on accepting change or critical reflection and critical feedback and what's happening. And, you know, like Bonnie mentioned, you're not always in control of the end results. Certainly I feel very upset when research isn't published, because the organisational culture can't really, whilst they'll take it on board and talk about it in the leadership team, they've still got a closed door in terms of being transparent and sharing that with everyone, because they feel it's not, you know, some things are critical. But obviously as part of research, you know, it's always critical in a positive way in terms of change. It's people's attitude towards risk and change that you need to educate them on too.
Thank you so much, guys. As I've said a few times, we've had questions coming in thick and fast, so my job gets even easier now as I turn to our floor. And the first question is coming in from Sarah or Sarah Southern, and then we'll turn to Duncan next. So Sarah or Sarah?
Sarah, no problem. I always get it. So Bonnie, Joanne, thank you so much. This is just really fascinating and really engaging. I think I mainly was just wanting to ask you, Joanne, how you've found it that have you actually found as you've worked with those you know, those decision makers and the local authorities and things, that they start to see the value of that diversity? Or sometimes what I find is that they then just transfer the responsibility for diversity onto you as this kind of, you know, intermediary person, and they don't actually engage with the concepts. Then it's almost another tick box of, oh great, well we've got Joanne now, she does the diversity box for us. And it's sometimes how to move that forward, because I find often that the lack of diversity in some of the decision makers and those panels who put together, you know, interventions or programs is what then reflects their lack of diversity and stakeholder engagement.
Yeah. It's painful. It is painful at times. And so I recently presented a big piece of work. I won't say you full. And there was silence at one of their board meetings. And I think the first question was, okay, can you share good practice from your own organisation around race equality? I think that was a terrifying question for them, and they didn't have the answer. But to present this piece of work, it was terrifying for them in this main group, of which there was 20 stakeholders, So what I've done is I've gone back to offering a focus group on Zoom, a smaller, more intimate thing where people can be honest and have an open conversation around trust. And be able to share the fears around, we're not very good at this, we're getting this wrong. So organisations I work with, I haven't done it for 30 years. I think I can sometimes sense when people just want to tick the box. So I have been offered high profile work that I've rejected because I just, the values aren't in line. I'm not wasting my time. I'm not wasting other people's time. I'm also doing an MBA currently at the minute, and I had to reflect on my leadership journey. And I suppose it's relevant in this field that if somebody's values align with mine around equality and diversity, they get a tick in the box from me, and that's all fine. If someone's doesn't have the same values, they're somehow treated by me as the other end of the scale and completely anti-equality, and that's not quite the case, is it? So I have to reflect on my own journey about how do I encourage those people who perhaps it's just not as important to as it is to me. In doing that. So it's a value-based, the work I do is value-based, and the organisations I work with have similar values, and I will reject work on the basis that they won't do that, because I've learned from experience that I'm wasting my time and everyone else's, and I don't want to be used in that position that we got a black consultant in to talk about race, therefore we've done that, and then 2 years down the line nothing has changed within that organisation. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. We turn next to Duncan. Duncan has a question.
Thanks very much, Adam. I'm going to bring this quite a bit up. One of the roles I currently do is making sure that nobody's left behind in the digital move that we've got. Predominantly, I'm working in the energy sector just now. So engagement has historically been taken by regulators in the finance area, in utilities, as qual and quant. Actually go out, do stuff, give us a representative sample back, with a need to make sure no one's left behind as we progress to greater digitalization, and be that people with smart meters, being able to read the meters, being able to get the same benefits as people down the street with an electric vehicle when they can't afford an electric vehicle, for example. How can social value and co-production gain traction when the regulators are not as forward thinking as maybe some of the businesses are these days in the utility sector and the finance sector? I'll give that to Bonnie to start with, and then see if Joanne can have a think about it as well.
Thank you. Well, I understand there's kind of regulators, so maybe I'll let Joanne answer that part. But the digital inclusion is a very important topic, and I started, explaining my experience by saying that I noticed that illiterate populations are not included as much, and how can we think of ways that actually allow them to express themselves in the same way. And I think that's the same thinking we need to have for with regards to digital inclusion, and think about the digitally excluded population. I really appreciate you bringing up the no one left behind agenda, because I actually wanted to say it earlier as well, that underpinning all the sustainable development goals is the idea, leave no one behind. Practically how we can do it is, I think, for those who are in positions of power in commissioning research and evaluation, that they undertake equality impact assessment to understand who is not being reached by this research, or they allocate a specific budget, and a lot of organizations do that, on accessibility. But accessibility just not only in terms of physical impairments, but also not having access to digital technology and addressing that. And I think when it comes to organizations that are not very forward thinking, or who don't get this agenda right away, unfortunately, you do need to revert to some very basic arguments, such as cost effectiveness, or talk about kind of cost savings in the long term as a result of using this approach, or talking about the potential market opportunity by reaching those that currently are not being reached. And if you do it now, then you'll be having the first mover advantage. And yeah, really using kind of arguments like that are more utilitarian to get them adopt this agenda, and eventually then hopefully move them to this direction. But co-production, I think, would have to be quite far down the line. Like, you first have to get organizations believe in the importance of hearing from diverse voices, and then step by step you get to kind of remodel the power dynamics and get to a point where co-production could truly be taking place. Hope that's helpful, Joanne.
That's very helpful, thank you.
I realise I'm quite fortunate in some of the roles that I have. So I'm a counsellor in Liverpool East, which is a community. It's one of the most diverse, well, it is the most diverse community in the Liverpool City region, with over 50% of people from ethnic minority backgrounds. But historically, it's also got a wealth of community organisations and a real creative, talented people who are real assets within their community. So I've had, I call myself a social entrepreneur, but I think I'm just a hustler, really. I've had so many different jobs and contracts. I've had roles where I've coached people who have got barriers to inclusion, where I've engaged them to just engage with organisations, whether that's to resolve debt or whether that's to get out of the house and talk to somebody, whether that is to learn computer skills at a very slow pace. My mother's 67, she's been on 20 courses about how to send an email. She still has to get me to send an email, even though she was a professional in her way. She's just not computer savvy and never will be. So I think, I would, in the position I'm in, and I realise that I have, it's not the same case for everybody, and that Liverpool has a plethora of community organisations generally, but in terms of reaching everybody, I know there's somebody who can reach somebody. So I would always work with others to make sure that people are included. And I think that's why we're able to be successful at Innovision, because we don't leave people behind, because we've got those roots into communities that touch everybody. So a strong, firm believer in asset-based community development, then communities have got the solutions to their own problems. And if I think about an incident last year when COVID cases rose just before Eid in our ward, we had just a plethora of people and organisations that could reach everybody, from door knocking to actually, going to the mosque, to going to community centres, to going to schools. We could reach the community and get a message out fairly quickly for those people who didn't speak English as a first language, or perhaps were listening to WhatsApp messages that were from a different country talking about COVID that was totally misinformed. But we were able to reach everybody because of our network of people and the community activism within this particular community. So I realise that that's not the case everywhere, but if you were to give me a task of reaching everybody, that's how I would do it.
Amazing, thank you both. I turn to Jan. Jan Rogers has a question.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Good. I've worked in corporates a lot of my life, as well as sort of social enterprises and different things. And one of the things within, if you like, stakeholder engagement, within change management, certainly within corporates, is a real fear factor. Not least because most of the people, certainly within corporates, are dependent on keeping their jobs. So when it comes to feedback, real, let's say, truthful feedback, a lot of them are very concerned about speaking out, especially if what they're saying goes against the general consensus of what needs to happen or what the executive board wants to happen. So quite often they don't participate simply because they don't see that whatever they say and putting themselves at risk or their jobs at risk is actually going to have an impact, because nobody's actually going to listen to what they say. So I just wondered how sort of Joanna and Bonnie have dealt with that when dealing with stakeholders. How do you go into a job? How do you accept a contract? How do you look at whether or not those stakeholder voices are really going to be listened to, or whether you're being used as a tick box exercise.
So I think I can give an example of working in a senior civil service organisation, and there wasn't much honesty coming through the staff survey every year. It wasn't that anonymous, really. It was broken down into departments. People were recognised. There wasn't that many minority people in the organisation. And I know, there's a rule about not reporting over 10, but if there's only 12 people and all feel like this, or all the women feel like this, then it was fairly obvious. So we made it more anonymous, and we've done more focus groups. I personally take personal responsibility that, what I listen to in the room, if it's confidential, it will be confidential. So if my neck was on the line as a result of being confidential, then I'm with that. But I wouldn't, I undertook focus groups, absolutely reassuring people that what got said in the room stayed in the room, that only themes will come out of it. And it is difficult because the culture of the organisation impacts, and if there's a negative consequence to speaking out, then people won't speak out. But there is ways of gleaning that information and making yourself the person in the middle, or the scapegoat if it all goes horribly wrong, let's face it, in terms of getting the message out of what the issues are, without making people recognise, because that's really important. I think when you need to honour, if you're saying something confidential, saying it's confidential, then you need to honour that. But yeah, I think one of the reasons why I left the civil service is because I've done a big role of protecting everybody else, realising my neck was on the line.
Yeah.
Diversity, but hey ho, I lived with that, and I moved on. But I absolutely told the organisation what they didn't want to hear, and I presented a business case that you argue with, and then my days were numbered.
Sounds like why I'm not with corporates anymore.
Because it might not be the answer you want to hear, but
yeah.
Yeah, I think I will just add, in terms of how I've try to approach this topic. One of my clients, and it's quite rare to have clients like this, but she asked me to actually come up with a set of criteria when I work with clients, kind of really thinking, of course, clients will have lots of expectations of consultants, but actually consultants should also have expectations from clients. And some of the things I look at is, are they willing to be uncomfortable? That's really, really important. And asking them for examples when they have been uncomfortable and when they have had to do things that they didn't want. And I think, trying to understand that from the beginning. But of course, it is quite hard to gauge. And so my other practical tip is, I'm never reliant on just one single client. Of course, everyone might be doing things differently, but as a consultant, I have to think about kind of my different sources of income. And I just try to make sure that I'm not overly influenced by one client, that if I speak truth to power to them, that I will just completely go bankrupt, right? So that's just a very practical thing. So I can always be sure that I wouldn't let those material incentives shut my mouth, basically.
Amazing, thank you so much. The questions are still coming in, but I'm going to bring it to an end now. And to say thank you. You always know when a session like this is valuable, because there's got a lot of conversation. So immediately, thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you so much, Joanne. I always make notes as we're going through, and I sort of reflect on them, and there's a sort of thread here that I have, which goes, we're first of all confused as to why we wouldn't do this, why we wouldn't employ true listening, employing empathy, being mindful of power and taking actions on that feedback to understand the real issues that people face and involving them in the process. Again, it sounds like common sense, but I know that's not what's happening enough. It's about translating the needs of people and translating it for decision makers, and showing the benefits of market opportunity, cost reduction, better products. But there's a fundamental need to challenge power dynamics. And it's a part of fundamental research ethics. But there is this challenge. We may have to challenge the motivation of some who commission the work. We may have to speak truth to power. and be very conscious of our own income streams along the way, perhaps as well. But we need to make it acceptable to have the voices of people heard and unlearn some of our jargon along the way. Both of our speakers today demonstrate the integrity, I think, that's required to do this. And again, I say thank you from the absolute bottom of my heart from SVI and Efrico. It's been fantastic. We do have a series of webinars. I hope you can join us for the next one. The next one is scheduled for the beginning of May, the 4th of May, where we talk about impact investing. It's good, but is it enough? Again, a final thank you and a final farewell, to our presenters, our speakers, and to you, our attendees. Please do have a look at the Efiko Academy. We offer a range of training solutions. You can go it alone, you can be that autonomous learner, or you can join a social learning cohort. And our next cohort is scheduled to start on the 13th of April. I hope you've enjoyed today. Please do have a look at what we have to offer. If you like what you've heard today, I'm sure you'll like the next webinar. I'm sure you'll like what we're providing, helping us all to change the way the world accounts for value and create that sustainable and more equitable society that we all want. Joanne, Bonnie, thank you so much. Everybody else who's joined us, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, wherever you are around the world. Thank you so much.